Hello, Bravs. We're back with Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor by Major General Frank Richardson. And move on to chapter 7, Mistresses, which will be broken up into 3 parts. It's 20-some pages long, and usually about 7 or 8 pages is all you can get out of this without it becoming torturous. Chapter 7, Mistresses. Josephine's unfaithfulness drove Napoleon into the arms of a succession of mistresses, some of whom held the center of the stage for a long time. Others played small parts, and still others flit across the scene, omitted from some biographies, alluded to in others by name or by initials, like Mr. X in newspaper reports of blackmail cases. Napoleon himself put the total at 7, and the much higher estimates given by some writers such as Masson, Turquois, and Aretz, a good law firm they are, may be accounted for by the temptation to boast about any hint of friendship with the great man. Guy Breton mentions many mistresses not noticed by other writers, providing Napoleon with so many affairs to satisfy the inordinate lust with which he credits him, that one is left wondering how he found time for his other achievements. Although this book may not be in the scholarly tradition of Masson, Aretz, and Delderfield, much of its entertaining gossip is well authenticated by references to contemporary letters and memoirs. Again, I repeat the assertion that if this guy had a micropecker, which he might have, why was he so prolific in banging multiple people? And don't you think that, unless the women were just there for the power aspect, and the bros apparently, why would you continue to bang this guy with a micro penis if you were getting nothing out of it? In St. Helena, after reading the pamphlet about his love affairs, Napoleon vowed that he knew virtually nothing of several women said to have been his mistresses. He added, They make me out to be a Hercules. And this was at a time when he had succumbed to the habit of boasting about his conquests. None of Napoleon's mistresses strike the imagination as being in the tradition of the great courtesans. This may be because he was always determined not to allow them any political influence. On the other hand, it may be because there was something immature or half-hearted about his amours, almost as if he felt that an emperor ought to have mistresses. Part of the act, as it were, but he hardly knew what to do with them. Grassini, who complained that Napoleon's caresses were on the furtive side and often left the ladies unsatisfied, was not the only one of his mistresses to experience frustration of this sort. When he was 18, he had an encounter with a prostitute, whom he treated as a case for social study, questioning her in great detail about her way of life, and later writing a long and rather dull account of the conversation, explaining that he had to lead her on by feigning amorous intentions, which he intended later to prove that he lacked. But apart from this and the mild flirtations to which I have referred in Chapter 6, the only affair before his marriage which deserves attention was with Madame Turreau de Ligneris, the charming and vivacious wife of one of the representatives of the people with the army of Italy, in which General Bonaparte in 1794 was commanding the artillery. Louis Turreau set her cap at any available officer, and the weight of evidence suggests that her acquaintance with General Bonaparte did not reach the stage of what is sometimes archly referred to in legal proceedings as intimacy. It did, however, leave a wound in Napoleon's mind. In order to amuse Louise during a visit to the forward positions, he ordered a minor sortie, an affair of outposts, which was unnecessary and had no real military objective, but which resulted in some loss of life for which he very properly blamed himself to the end of his days. He frankly admitted that he had been trying to impress Louise, and it seems likely that his underlying motive was to assert the masculinity of which he had deep-seated doubts. He met her again in 1795 when it was rumored that he was the father of her child, but it has been more generally believed that she was just one of several important men's wives whose favors he courted in order to help his career. In his first affair after marrying Josephine, he used his position as a general in a much more reprehensible manner, reminiscent of King David's deplorable treatment of Uriah the Hittite. Napoleon's Bathsheba, nicknamed Belelote, was Pauline Forez, the flighty wife of a lieutenant, who had followed her husband to Egypt dressed in male uniform and had caught the eye of General Bonaparte, possibly at first on account of her slender, boyish appearance. Here we go. The man whore chases men too. Pauline Forest can be called Napoleon's first mistress, and his notorious affair with her marked a turning point in his life, and not only in his sex life. Irrefutable evidence that Josephine had resumed her affair with Hippolyte Charles, which was now a public scandal, stifled what was left of Bonaparte's youthful idealism. In his bitter outcry to Joseph about his unfaithful wife, part of which is quoted in the previous chapter, he wrote that he was tired of glory at 29, and nothing was left for him but complete egoism. The flagrantly shameless manner in which he now flaunted his own unfaithfulness suggests the betrayed husband's reaction to the realization that Josephine did not love him. Whether or not it was intended as revenge for his humiliation, his conduct might have been designed to ensure that not only his army in Egypt, but the whole world knew about the Forez affair. He pursued Pauline relentlessly and drove about with her in his open carriage, attended on horseback by his stepson, and aide-de-camp Eugene Beauharnais. He plumbed the depth of bad taste by taking her on his knee and kissing her repeatedly in Eugene's presence, and was most annoyed when next day Eugene asked Berthier to relieve him of further duty with the commander-in-chief. If he was trying to hurt Josephine through her son, he did not want to lose such a good officer, and thereafter he was more circumspect in Eugene's presence. Pauline reveled in the situation, wearing dazzling uniforms in public. Why didn't he refrain from pulling noses? Gold-braided coats, bright sashes, plumed hats, and always the tight white pantaloons, which set off her trim figure and perhaps kept the general enslaved. Soon to Pauline's nickname of Belelote were added epithets such as Madame la Générale, Cleopatra, Our Lady of the Orient, and to the Arabs she was the great Sultan's lady. To get her to himself, Bonaparte sent Lieutenant Forez to France with despatches, and installed her in a house near his own headquarters. Whatever we may think of the general's conduct as a man, he deserves nothing but censure as a military leader. A more humane and thoughtful commander would not have paraded the fact that he was so adequately provided with what most of his men lacked. Although some 300 women, many of them dressed as men, sailed with the army to Egypt, there were not nearly enough to go around. Partly, no doubt, as a result of this, homosexual practices were prevalent, and as we shall see, Bonaparte's open affair with Belelote did not spare him from suspicion on this score. Bonaparte's plot to secure the lieutenant's wife for himself was foiled by the British Navy, which captured the ship on which Forez was sailing to France, took his dispatches, which proved to be worthless, kept the crew of the ship as prisoners of war, but landed him back in Egypt on purpose to annoy Boney, it has been said. The general's affair was so widely known about in the army of Egypt that it has been assumed that the English knew all about it through spies, and may have hoped to make things awkward for the enemy commander by returning an outraged husband to the carefully prepared love nest. There's Desiree Clary, Marie Waluska, The Countess de Montholon. The Count de Montholon. Is that the guy that wrote about the ghost story? Count Bertrand. Countess Bertrand. I'm in the land. That it was from such motives that the English were malicious enough to send Forez back to Cairo, as Masson put it, was the opinion widely held in France at the time. Madame Junot certainly believed this. However, it seems just as likely that the captain of Lion, or is it Lion, the ship which captured Forez, did not want to burden himself with unwanted prisoners during his long cruise in the Mediterranean, and chose to return Forez because his mission had failed, and he had given his parole. The enemy ship and its crew, a legitimate prize, would be in quite a different category to a naval officer. This was an age when courtesy and kindness to prisoners and fraternization between soldiers of opposing armies was at least one pleasant feature of war. It is also interesting that the subsequent publication of confidential letters revealing the French general's private family troubles, including his intention to divorce his wife, was strongly condemned. In an editorial in an English paper, the Morning Chronicle. It is nice to know that this sort of thing was not thought to be in keeping with our national dignity at the end of the 18th century. General Bonaparte may have believed that perfidious Albion would stoop to such a stratagem, but he was not the kind of general to bother overmuch about outraged husbands, especially those of junior rank. A military court was ordered to divorce Lieutenant Forez and his wife, and Forez had to submit. Napoleon was probably by then already a little tired of Pauline, though it is said that with his usual possessive jealousy, he was quite indignant for a time when he was told that after his return to France, she had become the mistress of his successor, General Kleber. Whores, all of them. In due course, Pauline herself returned to France, and Napoleon, after arranging her second marriage to a Count Henri de Ranchou, continued after his fashion to treat her with considerable financial generosity. The romantically minded Duchess of Abrantes was convinced that Pauline kept alive a warm affection for Napoleon until her death. But Masson, writing while she was still alive, poured cold water on this idea, claiming that she detested the emperor's memory and was a devoted royalist. When the Duchess, in her memoirs, repeated her story of undying love, Madame de Ranchou herself took Masson's side and emphatically contradicted the Duchess. She outlived Napoleon for nearly 50 years, remaining an object of occasional interest to Bonapartists. But by his liaison with Pauline Forez in Egypt, Napoleon hoped to prove himself capable of procreation, but he finally announced the little idiot does not know how to make a baby. She vigorously denied that it was her fault, and some readers of this book may perhaps take her side and echo her spirited retort, "Who knows if I am the idiot?" I thought he was talking about his dick. Oh, shit. I thought he meant his micropecker, his organ inferiority. But no, he was talking about Pauline. After his return from Egypt, an eventual reconciliation with Josephine, their marriage presented an outwardly respectable appearance, consonant with his increasing importance in the political world. Josephine would have been wiser to have made less fuss about his various liaisons, some of which were a byproduct of his love of Italian music and of the stage. In his youth, he had soaked himself in the history of ancient Rome, and the dream growing in his mind of himself becoming a blend of Julius Caesar and Charlemagne, heightened his interest in the lengthy classical dramas full of heroic declamation, which were the vogue at the time. Both he and Josephine became regular theater-goers and generous patrons of many actors and actresses. Napoleon's friendship and admiration for the great Talma never wavered, and his name was associated with many actresses, the most important ones being Mademoiselle Grassini, Duchesnois, Gazani, George, and Bourgogne, whose back view he found enticing, according to the persistent Monsieur Breton. Grassini could sing in a sweet soprano, but her speaking voice was deep, and it was this which attracted Napoleon. Grassini described Napoleon's love-making as unsatisfying, and her comparison of him with other lovers was most unflattering to him. However, undue weight need not be given to her verdict, for it was said that she was less of a passionate lover than one who was especially interested in the material advantages of having a distinguished patron. She certainly aspired to exert political influence, but for that aim she set her cap at the wrong man. Twice, in fact. It is true that she was Wellington's mistress in 1814. Whores again, I say, all of them. Another woman, not an actress, can be relegated to the category of the self-seeking. Madame Bellini, a charming Spaniard married to a Corsican, who tried to force herself upon the emperor in Elba after his second abdication. Realizing that he was leaving France without a mistress, she pursued him from Paris, dressed as a man. That's the way to do his heart. Dressed as a man and accompanied by her husband. To her surprise and distress, Napoleon would have nothing to do with her. He bought her off for 3,000 francs. Claude Manceron's comment is significant. He did not even want to see them, especially not her. No one seduced Napoleon twice. In pursuit of his actresses, the First Consul did not, of course, haunt the stage door. Constant, his valet, in a coach driven by the coachman César, more often than not a little drunk, would conduct the chosen lady to St. Cloud, where sometimes nothing more than a discussion of the play was required of her. On other occasions she would be told to disrobe and await Napoleon's arrival, but quite often after waiting for hours she would be sent home. The mood had passed, or affairs of state had deflected his thoughts from dalliance. As we see, Hollywood of old France was the same as Hollywood of now. It must have been very frustrating for the ladies, some of whom were never summoned again, and it was not surprising that many of them were rather caustic in their comments. Whether on the other side of the door frustration of some sort was at the bottom of Napoleon's failure to put in an appearance, we can only guess. The only one of his actresses to touch his heart was Mademoiselle Georges, with whom for at least 2 years during his courtship he maintained an affectionate relationship, from which it seems they both hoped a baby might result. Josephine had real cause for anxiety this time, for it was during his infatuation with his lovely Georgina that Napoleon first raised the question of separate bedrooms. Madame de Remusat told an amusing story of very unwillingly accompanying Josephine in an attempt to spy on Napoleon and Mademoiselle Georges. On the dark stairway outside that bedroom, they stumbled upon Roustan and fled in disorder. This same story, almost word for word, has been told in connection with Marie Woluska, a later mistress, which is an indication of the way in which Napoleon's amours became legendary. Mademoiselle Georges' outstanding quality was her ability to make the First Consul laugh. At their first meeting, apart from the possibly symbolic destruction of the veil given to her by her former admirer, Napoleon was content with a long conversation about her life and career. Roustan was present in the background behind the screen, and although Mademoiselle Georges stayed until 5 a.m., nothing happened. In the sense in which we are here, somewhat improperly interested. Masson tells us that Napoleon, with his genius for making hurtful comments, said, "You must have hideous feet, for you keep your stockings on." But perhaps we can respect him for some delicacy in feeling in allowing the acquaintance to ripen into mutual affection. It was always characterized by a sort of youthful cheerfulness, which suggests that it gave him the welcome relief from formality which his nature demanded. He had few relaxations, but Georgina could match him in his predilection for rather childish games. They played together like children at hide-and-seek, dressing up, and charades, in a way which strengthens the impression that there was always something just a little immature about Napoleon's sex life. There is strong evidence of immaturity and more than a hint of homosexuality in Mademoiselle George's sex life also. Like Napoleon, she obviously suffered from some defect of the pituitary gland, and although she retained her striking beauty for a long time, she became pathologically fat. This may have hastened the ending of her hold over Napoleon, for he always detested fat women. Her enormous bulk was the source of many unkind jests, and finally won for her the nickname of the Whale. She was a stickler for all the privileges of a prima donna, and an official of the theater had to walk before her striking the floor with a white wand. Unkind friends used to say that he was testing the floorboard. Fuck! That's pretty good, honestly. Who is this? Who is this one? The Whale? Mademoiselle George. She sounds interesting. I'm gonna, wave this white wand in front of me. George became more than one man's mistress, but no one seems to have wanted to marry her. And amongst all the heroic parts for which she became famous, none sounds at all suggestive of feminine charm or appeal. Despite her statuesque beauty, at least one leading actor found it repellent to have to act with her. Her real name was Marguerite Josephine Waymer, and the very masculine nickname, sometimes incorrectly spelled Georges, which she adopted as her stage name, was given to her by her protectress, Mademoiselle Raucourt, an actress with an evil reputation. Gertrude Aretz says of Mademoiselle Raucourt that she was very free in her ways, and rumor ran that she had more inclination towards persons of her own sex than towards men. She habitually dressed as a man and was dressed as Papa by the child of a Madame Pommetti, with whom she was living when George first met her. Dressed up, in fact, cross-dressing seems to have been the order of the day, for later on, when Georges fled from France to Russia, where she wanted to take a stage engagement for which she feared she would not get official French sanction, she was accompanied by a handsome young male ballet dancer, dressed as a woman to evade detection at the frontier. This dancer, Dupont, may have made just as unconvincing the maidservant as Prince Charles Edward Stuart had done when dressed as Betty Burke during his escape from Scotland after his defeat at Culloden. I do not want to appear to clutch at straws in seeking for evidence of something a little odd in Napoleon's sex life. Nevertheless, in the story of Mademoiselle Georges and her association with Napoleon, there are a few straws which do seem to have been blowing around in a somewhat unusual wind. And I lost my spot. Some people must have thought so at the time, for in a contemporary book of erotic pictures, one cartoon depicts Mademoiselle Georges indulging in homosexual relations with Mademoiselle Raucourt, whilst in another Napoleon is shown as being plainly much more interested in Georges than she is in him. Napoleon's association with Georges did not long survive the humiliating scene, after he had some sort of seizure whilst in bed with her, already discussed in Chapter 2. And we'll stop there at my predestined stoppage of 2 spaces of text. All right, Bobs. Until next time.